Shakti ma'am.
Yes. Am I
audible?
audible? Yeah.
Yes. Please continue.
Okay. Good afternoon, all. We are glad to get all these audience with us. We from School of Open Learning welcome you all to such a gathering, which is on very important topic. And I welcome Professor Arthur from the Russian University to speak on the occasion, speak on the topic that is very important in contemporary world politics. And specifically today with us, Professor Umasankar Pandey, our principal, and our guide and Karam Yogi from our institute, head of the institute, will introduce and welcome Professor Arthur, and Mangal Dev from Department of Political Science, head of the department, and Sudhir, who is the organizer of this webinar. I welcome you all. I welcome all the faculty members from our School of Open Learning, and we are glad to get Professor Arthur Demchuk, head of the Department Comparative Politics. He's Faculty of Political Science from the Moscow State University, which is a very close university to Jawaharlal Nehru University, and to the heart of all the important aspect usually happen from that university. Being a student of School of International Studies, we are very much connected to that university. Welcome you, sir, as a speaker on such a important aspect that how Russia is managing and how Russia is doing this, managing the situation, which is bringing a new change in world politics and along with the European near abroad. Welcome you, sir. I'll request Professor Pandey to welcome Professor Arthur. Am I right, Mangal sir? Maybe you will introduce.
Mangalji, kindly unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Thank you, Shakti ji. I am Dr. Mangal Dev. Heartily welcome to all of you, especially our chief speaker, Professor Arthur Demchuk. And I requested our respected principal, Professor Umasankar Pandey. Sir, please formally welcome today's our chief guest and chief speaker, Arthur Demchuk. Pandey, sir.
Thank you. Namaskar. We really heartily welcome our main speaker, Professor Demchuk from Moscow State University. And really, this is the need of an hour. I would like to thank this Department of Political Science, School of Open Learning, Delhi University, to organize such a vibrant talk, which is the need of hour in the sense that a lot of activity related to the political things are going on into the entire world. Vis-a-vis related lot of impact on India also. So I think a lot of things will Professor Demchuk will address, giving all the scenario from there exactly what is happening to the entire world. Which you can call it as a European area as well as the Asian countries, the impact of all activity, especially how the things are going to be. So we again heartily welcome from Delhi University, sir, to you that you have given your such a precious time to this university. Thank you once again and welcome to all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And over to Sudhir Parida ji for conducting program. Sudhir ji.
Thank you, Mangal sir, Shakti ma'am. Thank you, principal sir. Thank you, Mangal sir, Shakti ma'am. Thank you, all of you. Principal sir. I would like to thank you all of you It's a great pleasure to have it's a great pleasure to have Professor Demchuk. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Demchuk with us. So basically, today we will discuss about the crisis between Russia and Ukraine, and Professor Demchuk will explain a kind of a non-Western pattern. I mean, all of we know about Western, maybe misinformation, maybe information, but Professor Demchuk will tell about a non-Western perspective. That's so I will introduce Professor Demchuk. Professor Arthur Demchuk. He is the head of Department of Comparative Politics, Faculty of Political Science, Moscow State University. He is also a leading research fellow in Institute for US and Canadian Studies, Russian Academy of Science. His academic interests include, kind of environment policy, conflict management, comparative politics, and international relations. He got a PhD in philosophy and Dr. Habib in political science, and both are from Moscow State University. To see doing his research. I will tell a little background. So Acharya Chanakya's told about sustainable that Vamo Yoga Ksamayor Yoni is a prerequisite, arrangement for sustainable development. Even if Immanuel can't tell about perpetual peace, but still we are far from peace. There, so during 2014, the realist Professor John Mearsheimer, he told that this Ukrainian crisis during 2014 is the result of the West. So now, again and again, if we hear Professor Fukuyama, he told that the liberal democratic idea is the end of all ideology. Is the end of human, development. This is the final ideology. But still, we are at conflict. So, Professor Demchuk will going I would like to could you hear us? Sir, kindly unmute your mic.
Okay, shall I start with my presentation? I cannot hear you, so there is some interruption.
Can you please unmute your mic, please?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so
it's not. It's not.
Sir has already unmuted, and
yes,
we correctly hear, sir. Sir, yes, you may proceed, sir. Thank you, sir. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much for this introduction. Dear colleagues, dear webinar organizers, I thank you all for inviting me. It's my privilege and pleasure to be a speaker and a chief speaker, as you say, at your webinar and to participate in the whole series of events. As I understand, it's the whole process for several months. It's Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav. So you commemorate the 75 years of Independence Day, of the independence of your country. And I remember from my childhood that in the Soviet Union we also celebrated that. And when I was a little boy, I remember when Indira Gandhi came to visit Moscow, I was on the street waving flags when Indira Gandhi and Brezhnev went from the airport to Kremlin. So I still remember that time, and I can assure you that we cherish this very, very long friendship, and Soviet Union was one of the countries that supported India struggle for independence and supported India all the time, starting from 1947 until recently, regardless of the changes in our country or in your country. And I'm also pleased to congratulate your school, University of Delhi School of Open Learning, for this wonderful jubilee, 100 years of existence. Comparing with our department is less than 15 years old. So we see that you have very long history and very long tradition. And I would also emphasize, it's very important from my point of view that you organize this webinar and provided me as a Russian scholar to share my views and speak on the very, very sensitive and painful topic that is important today for Russia, for Europe, and for the whole world. Russia-Ukrainian, actually it's Ukrainian crisis. If you let me open my presentation, I would like to share my presentation that I prepared, so I can see if let me see if I can show it. Sorry, how can I show it? I'm trying to share my screen. If you can allow me, I'm in a technical opportunity to share my presentation. Is it possible to do that?
Yes, Mohit, can you help, sir? Mohit,
I think that administrator should let me open my presentation.
Mohit or Anand, any one of you? Sudhir, can you please take it from your mail or something like that? You can share it.
Okay. Sir, I can tell you, or you can send me that file. I will open in my.
Okay. Sorry for technical sir, issues.
Sir, there is a share button. You can share your screen.
I can do that, right?
Okay.
Let me see, because I was thinking of sharing my screen.
Yes.
But
yes.
okay, but I think, oh yes, now I can do that. So can you see my screen now?
Yes.
So I will open my presentation if you can see it.
Yes, we got it, sir.
Okay, but I cannot see you. So maybe I should, what shall I do to see you at the same time, at the same moment? Is it okay like this, that I see part of the screen and you see another part of the screen?
Yes, sir, it's okay.
Oh, wonderful. Since March, or even earlier than that, March 2022, many sanctions have been imposed against Russia. And since the start of the military operation on the 24th of February, and we can witness unprecedented Russophobia in the West, and not only in the West, it is growing. But there are very, very few scholars and analysts in the West who are trying to understand the deep underlying causes of Ukrainian conflict or problems, crisis in Russia-Ukraine relations. And I hope that today our exchange of views, exchange of ideas can help to promote scientific, objective view of what was happening, and would allow us to understand all the events better. I will start with the causes of Russia-Ukraine crisis. First, we should look at historical developments. So to understand the reasons for today's events in Ukraine, it is important or necessary to know the history, and not only the history of the post-Soviet period, but very, very long history that dates back to 17th century. And eastern Ukraine, eastern part of Ukraine, the left bank of Dnieper River, voluntarily, I am emphasizing that, voluntarily, without any coercion, well, they voluntarily expressed their desire to be incorporated, to be protected by the Russian Tsar. So in 1654, in the middle of 17th century, Ukraine, eastern Ukraine, became part of Russia, even before the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union emerged. After that, several times borders were changed. And in 1783, in the late 18th century, 240, almost 240 years ago, Crimea and Sevastopol became part of Russia. They have never been a part of Ukraine before. It was Ottoman Turkish Empire, and after the war with Turkey, Russia got this territory. But Crimea with Sevastopol Navy base was transferred or donated like a gift to Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic, later in 1954, less than 70 years ago, by the Soviet leader Khrushchev, and it was to commemorate 300th anniversary of the reunification of Ukraine and Russia. So Ukraine got Crimea territory only less than 70 years ago. And at various times, other parts of Ukrainian territory were given to Ukraine after the Second World War. Western Ukraine became a part of Ukraine. Before that, it was the part of Poland. And Donetsk and Lugansk regions, eastern Ukraine, where conflict is now the most serious part of the conflict takes place in Donetsk and Lugansk territories. They again were given to Ukraine by the Soviet leadership. But by that time, it was not very important whom these lands belong to. For instance, be it Russia or Ukraine, there was the single market, single currency, the same legal system, the Soviet legal system. So there was no difference whether you live in Ukraine or you live in Russia or in Kazakhstan or in Armenia. There was some difference in language and culture, but for people, it was not that important where they live. They could communicate with each other in Russian. They can take advantage of the same healthcare system, same monetary system. Labor law was actually the same, so there was no difference in the Soviet Union in terms of human rights and opportunities. But the Soviet leaders were guided by pragmatic economic and managerial reasons, and they never asked people, the residents of those areas, whether they want to belong to Russia, Ukraine, or any other Soviet republic. So there was no referendum there. Crimea was just given to Ukraine, as the same happened with other parts of eastern Ukraine. Therefore, there was for a long time, Ukraine has been divided linguistically and really culturally, and there was a sort of religious divide. There was a huge influence of Catholic Church in the western part of Ukraine, bordering with Poland and Hungary, and of course, Orthodox Christianity or Russian Orthodox Church influence in the eastern part. And a linguistic divide was the most important one. So the eastern part of Ukraine was predominantly Russian-speaking. Even many Ukrainians considered Russian language as being their mother tongue, whereas in Western Ukraine, most of the people were speaking Ukrainian language. Next point, since 1991, we can witness the process of so-called Ukrainianization, like soft Ukrainianization, and creation of national Ukrainian identity, and identity based on maybe language, some culture, but most of all, this identity was based on contradiction with Russia. Yesterday, the first Ukrainian president, Kravchuk, passed away, and one of his books, and his major book he wrote in 1990s, was, the title of this book is Ukraine is not Russia. So the major idea of that time Ukrainian leadership was to separate as much as possible Ukraine from Russia, to emphasize that Ukraine is not Russia. It's opposite to Russia. It's very different. So nationalism has been growing. And after 30 years, this nationalism took the form of actually like racism or Nazism, very similar to Nazism in Germany in the 1930s, that Ukrainian nation is above all, Ukraina ponad все, Ukraine is above all the nations, and Russia is underdeveloped country. Ukraine is European, civilized country, and Russia is somehow Oriental, Eastern, barbarian country. So it was like, it was depicted in movies and in popular culture that Ukraine is civilized Europe and Russia is not civilized or backward and authoritarian Asian country, like something Stan, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Russia-stan. So it was this kind of depiction of Russia and Ukraine. With a very formal, with formal freedom of speech. So Ukrainian constitution, the first constitution of independent Ukraine, was formally democratic. There was no problem. Ukraine became part of the member of the Council of Europe, member of the United Nations. So with this formal freedom of speech, formal human rights protection, any positive statements about Russia or any criticism of official Ukrainian anti-Russian policy caused hostility and immediate negative reaction of Ukrainian authorities. And so-called true Ukrainians, people who considered them to be true Ukrainians. So they watched TV, and any journalist or any person who criticized Ukraine for this nationalism was considered to be enemy of the Ukrainian state and enemy of the Ukrainian nation, or agent of Russian imperialism. Yeah? But there was so-called silent majority. Majority of the people did not take part in political life. They were concerned about material things because the economic problems were huge in Ukraine as in Russia and other post-Soviet countries in 1990s. So they were more concerned about survival and not about self-expression. So they were focused on everyday life, and they did not oppose this process of Ukrainianization. So it was a kind of structural violence and information violence. So I will tell about that a little bit more later on. So as a person who studies conflicts and conflicts management, I can say that the major cause of conflict usually is some kind of inequality, political inequality, inequality of representation, inequality of enjoyment of different political, economic, and cultural rights, and using double standards. So this kind of inequality was perceived as injustice and caused protest and backlash in the eastern part of Ukraine. So as I would like to emphasize that all those processes The seeds of conflict were planted more than 30 years ago. It did not start in 2014 when Crimea became a part of Russia. It started long before that. And I well remember that time. I visit Ukraine. Okay, shall I maybe use full screen? Maybe it may be better. Okay. Can you still hear me?
Yes, sir, we can hear you.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So inequality and double standards led to that protest that was expressed in eastern part of Ukraine and in Crimea. And I have a question: why politicians in the West, in Europe, and across the ocean in the United States turned a blind eye at the growth of nationalism and Russophobia, not only in Ukraine but also in some other post-Soviet countries? The same we could see in Moldova. The same we could see in Georgia, and unfortunately, there are some indicators that Russophobia is growing in the Central Asian countries as well. There was no direct violence, but with the non-interference of the Council of Europe, United Nations, and other international actors, there was an increase of so-called structural violence in Ukraine that was coupled with cultural and informational violence. It's so-called slow violence, creating difficult, almost unbearable conditions for certain groups of people. So the country, Ukraine, has developed an essentially authoritarian or totalitarian atmosphere, very similar to what we know as political correctness in the Western countries. Like in the United States and Europe, you cannot say certain things because it will be politically not correct, and you will be not only criticized, but you can be fired from your job. I remember that one person was fired from Harvard University because he was questioning equal abilities of different kind of people for studies. So he was condemned as being racist and so on, and so he was expelled, or he was fired from Harvard University for this politically incorrect statements. The same took place in Ukraine. So the second set of the causes of the crisis was position of the West that never criticized Ukraine for that, and even tried not to notice that. So with the formal freedoms, there were no equal freedoms and equal opportunities. Ukrainian nationalists started with changing school books in history. So the old Soviet history school books for children from maybe 4th grade to the 10th grade were replaced by Ukrainian history textbooks that contained extreme nationalism. So Ukrainian history was created, was explained like a history of being subordinated to Russian Empire, constant struggle for independence, the history of suppression and starvation and suffering of Ukrainian people and under Russian dominant power. Many of those who are now fighting against Russian military in Ukraine, they were brought up at school with those textbooks. So they were taught and they learned to hate Russia, to hate Russia. And new Ukrainian mythology was created, some kind of myths and stories that never took place, of course. I remember when I was in Ukraine in 2000, and I think it was earlier than that. It was in 1996. In 1996, my Ukrainian colleagues told me they laughed at that one Ukrainian philologist, doctor of philology, wrote an article seriously arguing that Jesus Christ spoke ancient Ukrainian. So the mother tongue or native language of Jesus Christ was ancient Ukrainian language. So it was ridiculous. So even his colleagues were laughing at that, but this article was published. Yeah, you know. And after the so-called Orange Revolution in early in 2004, 2005, and especially after the events in 2014, it was actually coup d'etat because the President Yanukovych was removed from power and replaced by a group of politicians that took power and started to change Ukrainian legislation. So after 2014, nationalist ideology became dominant and prevailing ideology in Ukraine. And again, Western countries paid no attention to that. They use double standard. They say, okay, Ukraine has its own right to have its own ideology. So it's like kind of self-determination of the country. So we will not interfere into internal affairs of Ukraine. So it's a liberal, free country, free people and free country. They will create their own ideology and their own statehood. So again, it's kind of double standard. In some cases, Western countries try to interfere to protect human rights of certain groups of people, but in this case, nobody cared about human rights. Another question that we may ask, we may ask, why was it possible for the former Soviet republics like Ukraine, Azerbaijan, Georgia, or Moldova to become independent, to have sovereign statehood, to have their own authorities, their official language, their own symbols? But for regions that were there at the moment of the collapse of the Soviet Union, it became impossible. So if you give the right for self-determination and for sovereignty to the Soviet Republic, to Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, Azerbaijan, you should also not deny this right to smaller units that are within this country, within this newborn country. Why it is impossible for regions within them to gain at least some degree of autonomy, if not sovereignty? Why did Brexit, the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union, Brexit took several years, and there were lots of negotiations, making lots of arrangements for this Brexit, for breaking relationship of Britain with the European Union, and it took several months to do that, to make the Brexit happen. Everything was carefully planned, negotiated, and arranged. But the Soviet Union collapsed in just a couple of weeks. Again, double standards. In 2014, after this coup d'etat and after referendum in Crimea, I had to explain a lot to foreigners who visited Moscow to explain about Crimea, because I take this personally, because I personally grew up in Sevastopol. My father used to be a Navy officer there, so I lived in Sevastopol from 1967 to 1979 for 12 years. And in 1979, our family moved to Moscow. So I lived there in this period of the Soviet history. But I can say from my own experience and from my parents' experience that in 1960s, 1970s, Crimea and Sevastopol were culturally 100% Russian. So I am not surprised that at 2014 referendum, 90%, more than 90% of voters, they voted for independence and being for unification with Russia. That are real numbers. And I communicate with a couple of my classmates from Sevastopol, and they prove that it's a real outcome of this referendum. But my European and American colleagues, they do not believe. They say I cannot believe that referendum outcome may be like 95% to 5%. We could believe if it's 60-40, but not 95-5. So it might be somehow manipulated. But I'm saying that in Sevastopol and in Crimea, it's a real outcome of the referendum. I'm sure, if I can comment that as a scholar from my scholastic and academic view, I am sure that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in many post-Soviet countries that have ethnic and religious differences, especially Russian-speaking population in certain areas, it was well possible to apply the principle of federalism. This federalism works in Russia. It works in India. India is a great example how federalism works. Federalism works in Belgium and Canada. If Ukrainians do not like Russia or India or Eastern countries, they can use European experience in Belgium, in Germany, in Europe, or United States and Canada and Brazil in the Western Hemisphere. Why was federalism rejected? Several times the idea of federalism was rejected in Ukraine, and it was also rejected in Georgia, and it was also rejected in Moldova, where we have this Transnistria region, non-recognized, semi-independent. I communicate with colleagues from Eastern Ukraine, from Southern Ossetia, that separated from Georgia, and from Transnistria, from Moldova region. I think there are missed opportunities with federalism. Eastern Ukraine could become like a federal unit, like Crimea used to be a republic within Ukraine before 2014. So other regions could also get some powers, some authorities, this devolution from the center to regions, so to create new central federal provincial relations, and it could help to prevent this conflict. Maybe this military operation was not inevitable. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure, but only on the condition of joint coordinated actions by all stakeholders, all on whom it depended, including the United States, European Union, Ukraine, and taking into account the interests of all the parties. Dialogue was needed and mutual understanding was needed. I think that the introduction, you mentioned Professor Merzheimer. I also know his ideas, and I watched his lecture on Ukrainian crisis. I think I agree with Professor Merzheimer that the aim of the United Nations and the European Union was to peel Ukraine away from the Russian or the Soviet influence and to incorporate Ukraine into the Western, let's say, Western world by military means, by joining NATO, enlarging of NATO, and by economic means, by European Union enlargement or economic expansion and military expansion. And if that happened, Crimea Peninsula, where there is Sevastopol, Russian Navy base, could become NATO Navy base and will be aimed and will make a threat to Russian security interests. Russia's military operation followed along like 8 years of waiting for Ukraine to implement Minsk agreements. There are Minsk, maybe you know that in 2014 and 2015, there was the process of negotiation, a multilateral negotiation with Germany and France, Ukraine, and Russia. And there were agreements signed in capital of Belarus in Minsk. We call it Minsk agreements. There were two rounds of Minsk agreements. But after that, time passed, but Ukraine did not implement that. So the major idea of Minsk agreements was that Ukraine gives or grants a special status, special autonomous status to eastern regions of Ukraine. Those regions have free and fair elections there, and only after that Ukraine gets control over the border. So those regions could remain in Ukraine, they could not, might not separate it from Ukraine after free, fair election and gaining some autonomy powers, some degree of autonomy in terms of language, use of language, making decisions that affected regional population. But there was no constructive response from Western partners, also from NATO, for another proposal. In late 2021, Russian Federation issued, even published a draft of a treaty. Russia would like to conclude with NATO, with Western countries, about mutual security guarantees. So there was a proposal, there was a draft of the treaty about mutual security guarantees, non-enlargement of NATO, and nuclear arms control, but Western countries did not respond positively. Unfortunately, so non-implementation of Minsk agreement. So unfortunately, the leadership of Ukraine and NATO did not use the opportunity to resolve all those differences diplomatically, by diplomatic means, by implementing Minsk agreements, and by taking into account Russian Federation's concern about growing threat at the borders of Russia. As we remember from late Soviet and early post-Soviet history, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact organization, military bloc, Eastern military bloc, with Soviet Union and other socialist countries, Western countries, they did not dissolve NATO, and they verbally promised not to expand NATO. So they said, okay, we do not need NATO expansion because the Warsaw Pact no longer exists, so there is no problem. But later on, almost all the Eastern European countries, including Baltic states, joined NATO. Since no official documents were signed, the promise was not kept, and Russia perceived that as a deception. Once President Putin said that the great mistake of Russia was to trust Western countries. But the greater mistake of the Western countries was to misuse, to abuse, or to use this trust to deceive Russia. So there were two mistakes from both sides. Russia made a mistake of trusting other countries, trusting the West, and the West thought that Russia is weak and we can deceive Russia and make advantage of the weakness of the Russian Federation. Can you still hear me?
Yes, sir. Yes.
Oh, wonderful! Because I have no feedback. I can see only my screen. So if something is wrong with connection, please let me know. And another question may arise. So NATO has been expanding for 30 years, approaching Russian borders. That was again perceived by the Russian leadership as an increasing military threat. And another question I may put is, why was it necessary to push Ukraine into NATO, to make statements about plans of Ukraine? And Ukrainian President Zelensky expressed that view that sooner or later Ukraine is planning to regain nuclear weapons that were moved to Russia after collapse of the Soviet Union. So all the Ukraine has nuclear facilities, nuclear power stations, but all the nuclear arms, nuclear missiles were moved to Russia after collapse of the Soviet Union, from Belarus, from Ukraine, and from Kazakhstan. So all those countries do not possess nuclear arms because there was an agreement that they move all their nuclear arms to Russia. So Russia remained the only country among the post-Soviet countries with nuclear arms. And there was a special arrangement. And by the way, the Western countries and the United States were pushing all those countries to remove nuclear missiles from their territory, so that the West has to deal only with Russia. And although the other three countries, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, should not possess nuclear arms capacities. So it would be easier to deal with one country, with Russia, than to consider threats from Belarus, from Ukraine, from Kazakhstan. So, but Ukrainian president said, okay, in the past, Ukraine possessed nuclear missiles at its territory. Why cannot we get nuclear missiles again? And it was very serious statement. And given human potential, given human capital, engineers and scientists, nuclear scientists that were educated in the Soviet time, Ukraine, with the help of Western countries, with the help of the United States, Britain, France, they can develop their own nuclear missiles. They have technical and human capital. They have technical possibilities for that. So it was again a serious threat. And there are more and more proofs that there were military preparations by Ukrainian army with the help of Western aides, Western military advisors, to start a military operation to regain control over Donbas region. So after 8 years, Ukraine accumulated military capacity to start military operation and to get back those two regions that were not subordinated to Kiev authority. I am sure that such an operation of the Ukrainian army was planned sooner or later, counting on support of the West, since legally and from an international law point of view, those regions are still parts of Ukraine. So only Russia recognized independence of Lugansk and Donetsk republics. And NATO countries, United States, and the United Nations, they do not recognize those republics as sovereign states. So if we talk about Russian military operation, our politicians in all the countries, not only in Russia. Sorry, just a second. And also, apart from nuclearization of Ukraine, I should mention biological labs that were discovered during the military operation, discovered that there were biological labs where potentially biological weapons could have been developed. I think that politicians usually make decisions based on the worst case scenario to minimize risks. So it was 1,000 years ago that was the case, and it's the case right now. And I do not think that the decision of the Russian leadership was made spontaneously, without calculating different scenarios, calculating risks, and without taking into account the opinions of military experts and of political experts. So the purpose of this military operation that is ongoing now, it's not a war. It's not the war of Russia and Ukraine, and it's not the war against Ukraine as a nation. It's not a war against Ukrainian people. I'm trying to emphasize that when I talk to students, when I am interviewed by foreign journalists. Russia is not waging war against Ukrainian people. We still consider Ukrainian people as our brothers and sisters, because we Russians, Belarusians, and Ukrainians, we are three parts of the same nation. We think that we are not that different as Ukrainian nationalists said. So it's military operation. So there are just very few simple objectives of this military operation is to neutralize Ukrainian military facilities, military capacities of Ukraine that may pose a threat to Russian security and to the security of Donetsk and Lugansk region, and also to reduce the degree of the influence of nationalists in Ukrainian politics. maybe someday we find out, maybe historians will write about that 10, 20 or more years later, what was the real trigger of Russia's decision to launch this military operation. And it is well possible that in the near future or distant future, we will get evidence that there was the development of not only biological but also nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Apparently, I believe that the reasons of the Russian leadership were very, very serious, because the risks from what is happening, the risks of military operation and the risks and the consequences of sanctions against Russia are huge. I may recall and remind you of history. 60 years ago, in 1962, we know how seriously and how harshly the United States and President Kennedy, they reacted to the deployment of the Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba in 1962. We also remember NATO military operations in Yugoslavia in 1999, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and Libya, and in involvement in Syria. So how the United States and NATO reacts to some threats or perceived threats in different parts of the world. Of course, violence is the worst way to manage conflict. Negotiations are better, much better. Mediation may work. Of course, it's logical to negotiate. And but what to do? What will you do if agreements that were signed in Minsk, signed 2 times, they are not implemented? For how long we need to wait, and what shall we need for? Who prevented Ukraine? Who did not let Ukraine to implement Minsk agreements to keep its promises for 8 years? So this new Cold War is a result of more than 30 years long policies of the Western countries vis-a-vis late Soviet Union in the time of perestroika and post-Soviet Russia. There are several preconditions for settlement of Russia-Ukraine crisis. Well, this crisis will end, I'm sure. This crisis will end and the peace will be restored. But there are several preconditions for that. First is demilitarization of Ukraine. Then denazification of Ukraine. I mean by not denazification, we mean dissolution of extreme nationalist groups and making sure that those nationalists do not influence Ukrainian politics. Then providing minority rights protection, maybe by means of federalization, to provide minority rights protection to Russian-speaking population, to Hungarian-speaking population in the western part of Ukraine, and to other ethnic minorities and linguistic minorities in Ukraine. Then one of the most important precondition is for the end of this military operation is the recognition of Crimea as a part of Russia, recognition the outcome of referendum of 2014, and also recognition of two new republics, Donetsk and Lugansk People Republics, as sovereign states. And one of the possible scenario may be federalization of Ukraine, very similar to India, Russia, Canada, or Germany. Then, if I have some time left, and I think I have another maybe 5 or 10 minutes, I would like to talk a little bit about the new trends in international relations that are the implications of the Ukrainian crisis. There is a great increase of uncertainty and risks, and the increase in the number of the events that got the name of the Black Swan events. So including recent COVID-19 pandemic, which complicates the possibilities of forecasting, of prediction, and reduces our horizon of planning. The rivalry and struggle for strategic resources will continue. First of all, the life supporting resources that we need for life support, environmental resources, water resources, biological resources, energy resources, including those resources that are located on the territory of Russia. And we know that Russia possesses a huge portion of environmental resources on our planet Earth. There is a crisis of the rules of the game is growing. Disregard for legal and moral restrictions, including cultural restrictions, which are mechanisms for deterring aggression. The legitimacy of international law is being undermined. There is a disrespect even for national legal norms, including those related to property rights. Now, Western politicians, they say that we can confiscate, we can just take Russian assets in Western banks, or any Russian assets can be taken away from Russia and given to Ukraine or sold, and this money should go for other purposes. So even private property is not respected. And if they do that, I think it will undermine trust of the whole world to the United States and to Europe for a very long time. So nobody else will invest and save money in American and European banks, because there is a threat that at any time your money will disappear because of political decision of that country. There is also a crisis of intergovernmental or interstate institutions, conventions, international organizations that were created after the Second World War. And major powers show an instrumental attitude towards those institutions. So they consider them to be a pragmatic tool for pursuing their national interests. We know that the United States can withdraw from different international organizations and treaties, as they did when Trump was the president. They said we are no longer members of UNESCO, for instance. We are no longer members of Trans-Pacific Partnership and so on, because they think that those organizations were created to help them to promote their interests. And if this organization doesn't help, we are no longer members of this organization. Why should we pay fees to UNESCO if UNESCO takes a position that contradicts American interests? So, and there is I think there is a crisis of traditional majority rule decision-making mechanism in intergovernmental and other international organizations. So there is a need for consensus building mechanisms, deliberative democracy mechanisms that persist in the United Nations Security Council. So to make a decision, the UN Security Council, you need a consensus among 5 permanent members. And I think that Security Council of the UN may be enlarged, and of course such country as India should also have the become a permanent member of the United Nations, because United Nations Security Council, because India's population is more than 1 billion right now, so 1 billion people should be represented by a permanent member of the Security Council. But this Security Council and the principle of unanimity of permanent members ensured and protected international stability for more than 75 years. There is a re-ideologization of international relations to replace pragmatism. So rationalism somehow fades into the background. Double standards are used. Ideological and moral relativism is applied. Kosovo can get its independence and Kosovo can be recognized, but for instance, Transnistria or Lugansk or Donetsk republics, it's another story. It's very different from Kosovo. No, you should recognize Kosovo, but you should never recognize those new countries. So if you apply the same standards, you should apply the same standards to Kosovo and to other countries. So it's ideological polarization and moral relativism. Ideological polarization means that all the world is divided into good and evil, black and white. Yeah. So, and we observe this phenomena that neutrality is not accepted, there is a requirement. You should decide which side do you take. And now I know that China and India are asked by the United States that you should decide whether you support the Western community, the West against Russia, or you are supporting Russia if you do not support us. So those who are not with us are automatically against us. Yeah. So many countries, they have to make this very, very tough choice, or they face this tough choice. So all the world is divided into friends and enemies. So the current events and Russian-Ukrainian crisis is depicted as a struggle between good, represented by the West, and evil, represented by Russia and its allies. So a total war. There is a total war in which all means and methods may be justified. The problem of trust becomes a global problem of international relations. Trust is almost ruined everywhere. Nobody trusts nobody else. Fear and uncertainty lead to the tactics of so-called prisoner's dilemma logic, that is making decisions under risk conditions based on worst case scenario. So we think about the worst case scenario of the developments and make our decision based on this scenario. So it does not lead us to win-win solution. We miss this win-win solution because there is no trust. If we cannot trust another person, we should suspect this person or this country to do something bad. So and we should be prepared for the worst case scenario. Fragmentation and regionalization of the world. So now the world is more fragmented than ever before. Regionalization is another trend opposite to globalization. So we may say that constantly the whole world is divided into so-called the West and the rest. So the West includes Western Europe, North American countries, and like Japan, Australia, some other countries that are within the sphere of influence of the Western countries, and the rest of the world, like Russia and China, that improve and intensify partnership. Some Arab countries that do not support the West. Some Latin American countries that try to be independent, make their independent foreign policy. Yeah. So it's and the new macro-regional and global blocks and alliances are emerging. Like we can talk about so-called collective West, and maybe BRICS countries can have a say in international politics more. We have this experience of cooperation between India, Russia, China, Brazil, South Africa, BRICS countries that have half of the world population lives, almost a half of the world population lives in those countries. So we may think about our role, BRICS countries' role in world politics. So there is a huge divide, new dividing lines in the world, and we can witness the slowdown of integration processes. Brexit and the failure of to pass European to make a European constitution, European Union constitution. There are two referenda in France and the Netherlands were negative, so there is no European constitution. And then Brexit followed, so we can see the slowdown of integration processes. And as my conclusion, I would say that our world is returns, we're going back to so-called political realism in international relations. So we think about each country in terms of its power. International relations are based on the balance of powers, and countries are driven by national interests. First of all, security and survival interests. I would like to thank again the organizers of our our webinar. At this point, I end my presentation. Thank you for your initiative to have this kind of talk, of this kind of webinar, and invitation to participate. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Demchuk. It was really very fruitful and very energetic speak for us, and very informative to us. It's kind of non-Western perspective, non-Western informations to us, because most new they are mostly covered from source for us to understand both the sides. So, I would like to participants. Some 3-4 something like that. Ask questions. Floor is open to.
I can see one question in the chat. About international organizations.
Can you hear me? Can I audible to you?
I can hear you, but not all the words.
The
sound interrupts every 2 seconds. I can hear you for 2 seconds, but then for 1 second, no sound. Sorry.
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So, some attendee Vikas, he has a question. Sir, in Russia-Ukraine conflict, we saw how the world the organization, I mean the United Nations, they need to change in this new world order. I mean, there's the questions of Vikas.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's it's very complicated question because we have to ask ourselves what shall be changed, whether the United Nations organization should be changed. If yes, how it can be changed. So what does not let the United Nations to manage those conflicts effectively? Or the whole system, international systems should change. Maybe we need to have like a new multi-party negotiation, or like the World Conference discussing the new rules of the game, new rules of behavior in the new changing world order. Of course, there are some features of the UN that has not changed since 1945, when the United Nations was created. Its statutes reflected the ideas, dominant ideas of that time. So the major idea was to prevent the New World War. But the UN was not very well designed for managing regional conflict, and especially some civil wars and internal conflicts. We know that there are several ideas of peacekeeping, peacemaking, peace building, post-conflict settlement, preventing conflicts, but the UN has limited resources to do that. I mean that not all the countries they perceive or think that the UN or some other countries have legitimate right to resolve or to interfere in certain kind of conflicts. For instance, United Nations forces cannot be sent into a certain area if there is no agreement with the regional or local government. And imagine that you are dealing with Ukrainian conflict. This area, Eastern Ukraine, they proclaimed their sovereignty, their independence. But legally, from the UN point of view, this is the territory of Ukraine. So theoretically, Ukrainian government may agree to have United Nations peacekeeping forces to send to this region. But the administration of those regions will not think that it's legitimate and it's legal, because they did not give their consent for this kind of involvement. And again, this problem of unanimity of the key powers, of key powers. Now there is an idea of get rid of this principle, not to use this principle of unanimity of permanent members of the Security Council. But I don't think that the other permanent members like China will agree with that. I'm not sure. The United States will not agree with that, because the United States are interested in having veto power, that no decision is made against the interests of the United States. So it's not the problem that Russia uses its veto power, and that's why United Nations cannot do anything in the crisis. I think when it comes to the changing of the United Nations statute, the other countries who have veto power will not just give this right away. You may think about some other mechanisms, but it's very hard to say which mechanism will be approved or adopted or agreed upon, because of huge cultural differences, because of national interests. So you need some kind of mechanism that will replace the existing mechanism, but all the members of the international community think that they are better off compared with the old mechanism. So the new mechanism will make everyone better off, so everyone will gain, everyone will think that their situation becomes better than it used to be under the old mechanism. So no one should think that this is worse for them than the old existing mechanism. That's the problem. How to reconcile 190 something international interests of all the countries, let's say. Okay, I can see that there are some other questions about geostrategic aspects of Russia-Ukraine crisis situation. Well, geostrategic aspects, I may say that they are mostly about logistics, of trade logistics, and about military political concerns, because this territory of Ukraine could be used by NATO, for instance, for deployment of nuclear arms, and those nuclear arms will create a huge military threat to Russia. Then, okay, let me see. Saurav, master student, why Russia is not emphasizing on soft power to influence? Well, Russia has some soft power instruments, but you may understand that the other countries also use soft power, and soft power of Hollywood is much stronger than the soft power of Russian filmmakers, for instance, as we know. And the Western world has developed this machine of information production of information, and they are very much experienced in some different manipulation techniques. There's journalists, newspapers, filmmakers, so it's very hard to confront them in terms of soft power. But of course, there are Russian centers of Russian language and culture abroad, but that they exist in many countries. So you can study Russian, you can watch Russian movies, and you can also visit Russian websites. But as you know, Western countries imposed several restrictions. Like on YouTube, you may not watch some materials produced by Russian officials. Russia Today TV channel is banned in some Western countries, in Western European countries, in the Baltic countries. Some countries, they do not allow to receive Russian television. Yeah. So in some countries you need to use VPN to access Russian websites. So it's there are three levels of this struggle. There is a military operation, so it's military struggle. Then there is economic war against Russia, sanctions, and there is information war against Russia, to create like public opinion in the West that is anti-Russian. And I was shocked when my friends told me that in some European countries, like in Switzerland, in March, this year in March, one Russian boy at school, he's 12 years old, he was beaten at school in Switzerland because he was Russian. Can you imagine that? Switzerland is a neutral country. There are no Russians, no Ukrainians there. It's not like in Poland. It's officially this country is not Russophobic country, but it happened even in Switzerland. Okay, let me see some other questions. Okay. How the state of Russia sees Indian approach to this conflict and how Russia deals with relations with India and China. Yes, well, I'm not an expert of relations with China and with India, yeah, but I know that Russia is interested in maintaining and improving and enhancing cooperation with India. India may purchase Russian oil and maybe even Russian gas. There is an idea of creating pipeline to India, but technically it's not that easy. Russia increases its trade relations with China, and we think that India has very balanced approach to this conflict. Once I was interviewed by Russia Today TV, and another speaker there was the former Indian, I think he was the head of Indian electoral body, electoral commission, and he had very balanced approach. That he said that India understands the reasons of that military operation. That nationalism was growing. There was an extreme nationalism in Ukraine, and it was a threat to those regions, to Russian-speaking population, and there was a military threat to Russia. So he was not an advocate of Russian military operation. He did not support that, but he said that you should understand the reasons. And I think that that Indian position is very well balanced. Okay, and relations with China. Yes, we think that China now is the major economic partner of our country because of existing contracts and of existing economic relations. Okay. Every country leaders talk about peace, but actions do not want peace. Well, I would not say that every leader wants domination between countries. I think that every leader should be concerned about the national interests, about the well-being of the country, about military power, about security. So security, survival, values of survival, of security, of well-being are the driving forces. And maybe leaders think that if they dominate, it may help them to achieve the economic goals and to promote they feel more secure if they have control over certain territories, over certain events. But I don't think that it's just objective by itself. So they seek domination for somehow for their self-esteem or for something like that. So it's the reason for this idea that we should have everything under our control. It may help us as leaders to feel more secure in international relations as well. Russia has now withdrawn. Oh, sorry. Okay. Russia has now withdrawn its forces from northern part of Ukraine. Describe in brief. Yes, if you mean those part of Ukraine that is not far from the capital of Ukraine, northern part of Ukraine. I think that it was done for military concerns. So Russia is now focused on operation in the eastern part of Ukraine, so to help Donetsk and Lugansk republics to liberate their territory. So this is the major concern. So the idea of Russia is not to conquer or to occupy Ukraine. It's not the idea of this military operation. So Russia does not want to have this northern Ukraine territory like to Kiev or Kharkov region to become Russian territory. The idea is to help Donetsk and Lugansk regions to get control over their two regions. And so Russia is now focused on military operation in this eastern part. So maybe it's just the relocation of troops. It's a tactical move. Okay. Why Russia? Again, the same question. Information war going on propaganda sphere. It seems that even among intellectuals still do not understand the reasons they strictly again. Well, a very interesting question by Daria. There are some intellectual public in Russia still don't understand the reasons and strictly against the special operation. I know that in Russia, Russian society is somehow divided in their attitude to this operation. It's like Pareto law, 80 to 20. 80% support military operation, 20% are either against or they are indefinite. So they are, remain neutral. That's why I think the reason is that this military operation was prepared maybe in secret, and there was no information campaign explaining people what was going on in Ukraine. Only after the operation started, we got more and more information about how people lived in those regions for 8 years, and how hard was for them to live, and when Ukraine was shelling Donetsk and other parts of those republics, and there were new facts, new evidence about discrimination in Ukraine. So in this case, I think that Russia was not very well prepared for information war. We were somehow prepared for military operation and for economic consequences, but not for this information war properly. But now Russia is doing more and more in terms of information support, and Russia invites foreign journalists from the West, from Europe, from the United States to go to this region, of course, to safe places, to speak to people, to learn about their life, to learn the truth about what happened. And as you know, there were some accusations of Russian military for atrocities, for some crimes against humanity. But after several days, there was complete silence, because Russian journalists and even some American journalists proved that it was fake. It was all fake news about what happened in Bucha, for instance, that some people were shot by Russian military, and it turned out that they were shot and killed before that by Ukrainian missiles, Ukrainian shells. So we still miss informing our population about government position, about providing more and more facts, but we are trying to catch up. Okay. We have been seeing since several years that some rising power is weakening the power of US and Western hegemony. Is the reason? It's an interesting question, Vikash Singh put. The reason USA has not done anything to stop the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They were saying that they are against military operation of Russia. They predicted that Russia could start military operation on the 16th of February. They even had the exact date of this operation, and President Biden talked. But I think that the real interest of the United States and the West is now that this military operation lasts as long as possible. For many reasons. For military industrial complex is the good reason to produce more arms, to get more funding, and of course this military operation can weaken Russia. We use lots of resources for this military operation, and United States was not interested in stopping Ukraine from military buildup and from this nationalism, because the US never addressed the causes of this conflict that I explained to you. The United States never criticized Ukraine for nationalism, and never criticized Ukraine for the idea of military operation in the eastern part of Ukraine to regain control over this territory. So I think that it's in the interest of the United States to continue this conflict to continue as long as possible, because they well understand that this conflict will end, and will end on some terms that Russian Federation suggests. So the military operation will end when Russian Federation will get guarantees of neutral status of Ukraine, no military threat from Ukrainian territory, no Nazi ideology in Ukraine, and the Russian status of Crimea. So, and without that, there will be no treaty, no agreement with Ukraine. And it's not in the interest of the United States that Ukraine recognizes Russian Crimea or recognizes those republics. Okay, next. Well, many scholars see this crisis as a struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. How valid is this type of perspective among the scholars? Well, Western scholars, yes, they say that yes, that this is the theory of democratic peace theory, that the democracies do not fight each other. So there are no wars between democratic countries. So if there is a war, at least one country is not democratic. But it depends on how you perceive that. So do you think that Ukraine is democracy? I am not sure. I am not sure, given the way they changed their government in 2014. So I can hardly think that Ukraine is a fully democratic country. It's so-called facade democracy. So formally, yes, there is democratic constitution, but in real life you can see many indicators that it's not democratic. Yes, well, Russia is accused of being authoritarian country as China and many other countries. It depends on what criteria do you use for authoritarianism or for democracy. What type of? Okay, let me see. How do you see India in international politics? I can say that India is among the rising powers in international politics. Yes, I do think so. Yes, India becomes more and more important player in world politics because of huge strategic resources. You have huge human potential, economic potential. And as far as I know, India possesses nuclear technologies as well. So from military point of view, India is a strong country. Okay, very clear.
Okay.
Oh.
I
Well, thank you so much for your nice words. It was my pleasure, and thank you for your questions and for your interest in knowing Russian perspective of this crisis. And I hope that our departments may cooperate virtually or in person. We can host your students at Moscow State University, as we did for several years with students, postgraduate students from Jawaharlal Nehru University. We have an agreement on cooperation with Jawaharlal Nehru University, and maybe we can think about our cooperation with the University of Delhi and Moscow State University. Thank you for your attention and for your questions.
By the way, I think the questions have over. We are moving towards the last session of this webinar. So everyone has participated and with a great enthusiastic. So now we will go for vote of thanks. So I will offer the vote of thanks by the way. So by the way, sir, you have started from the beginning. It's a great start that during the time of Brezhnev and Indira Gandhi, when Indian flags were waved off, and you just remembered your childhood, I mean adulthood. So I just remember my Moscow days when the same enthusiasm, euphoria I felt among the people still now. So that's still now I have seen there. So it's a really still going. Then I want to conclude that when Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, he were here after the crisis broke out. The first statement during the first section with our external affairs minister S. Jaishankar, he told that friendship is the word which defines the bilateral relations between India and Russia. So that's how it is. The euphoria is going on still now. So. And about NATO expansion, I just remember Putin's words that we are very much concerned about the NATO's expansions towards our border. So there are 5 phases of NATO expansion, and we are opposing all the phases. So that's the thing you described. You described about how Russophobic, how Russophobic is being created. Different historiography, different mythology in Ukraine, in Georgia, in Moldova. So I mean, all the foreign Soviet, states, how Russophobic was created. So you just told that. And about the cause, you just told that there is a large number of Russophobia, NATO expansion, European Union enlargement. Okay, the basic thing you proposed is that after 2014, there was a Minsk agreement, which is a kind of peace agreement, which is not considered by Ukrainians, and the West do not pay heed at this failure of the agreement. Okay, so you told about the solutions, about kind of demilitarization of Ukraine, denazification of Ukraine, minority rights to Russian-speaking public, to Hungarian-speaking public in the western part of the Ukraine, and recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk as states, like they during Kosovo crisis, Kosovo was recognized as a independent state. So without going further any double standards by the West, as different state. So and again in international perspective, you just emphasized that there must be a de-idealization of international relations, no double standards in international relations, and kind of trust should be developed, like you emphasized the how private property is being confiscated by the West. So that's the thing. And again, the peculiar point you told that the return of a realism in international political arena, in international relations. So that's the very crucial thing, because for the long time, in the experts in international relations, they have emphasized the balance of power, multipolarity rather than unipolar world. So that's very peaceful. So most of the realists actually emphasize either bipolar or multipolar world would be more peaceful rather unipolar one. So you emphasize that. So I would like to thank you again from the family of our university. I would like to thank our principal, Professor Pandey, that he facilitated us such a kind of a great webinar. We learned from you, heard from you. I would like to thank Dr. Mangal Deo. He's our coordinator, our department head, to facilitate such webinar. I would like to thank my colleague, Dr. Shakti Pradani, who has just initiated the program. And I would like to thank other teachers, Dr. Shwetank, Dr. Ranjan, and other teachers who have joined us to make this webinar very fruitful. I would also like to thank the SOL technical team, Mohit, Anand, Moiji, Anandji, all are extremely, I mean, they're helpful, cooperative during all these, technical glitches. And I would like to thank all the students and all other people who have really made this program very fruitful, very knowledgeous for all of us. Thank you again. Thank you all of you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Namaskar. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.